So and the thing that I've had to kind of learn the most in my artistic practice is learning how to ask for help and not needing to do everything myself because I oftentimes can. It's not that I'm like a control freak, but I often assume that I'm the only one who cares enough about the work that I'm doing that I have to do everything, and that is something that I have frequently believe that I've been disabused of. So that's one thing that I've found. But it's also been interesting for me to transition out of kind of like arts administrative work, where that was like my day to day, every day. I was doing like communications work for an organization called Fractured Atlas, which I'm sure many people are familiar with. Um, and I left that job and got a job doing web development after doing a boot camp, and I felt very conflicted about like the I still feel conflicted about, like the hours of my day that I spend working at a corporate job that pays a lot more than my arts job, that affords me a lot better healthcare, a much better like work-life balance and time. And like I had this really great sadness about kind of on the outside in of the nonprofit field about how much harm kind of the rat race of nonprofit work is, and the harm that I guess like average, or not average, but like what's kind of status quo in the nonprofit field, what we put our administrators through, what we ask of them, what we ask them to live off of, the hours we ask them to work, in the name of the mission or the work or whatever, and seeing like life on the outside, where my arts administrative work is like voluntary. I serve on the boards of two different arts and three different arts and art and culture organizations, and I also like do administrative work for the theater collective that I'm a part of. But all of that is like on my own terms, and I've developed such a better kind of like personal boundaries with like the administrative work and the artistic work, and holding those things in balance. So yeah, it's an interesting conversation.
Yeah. No, and personal boundaries are a thing that I'm still figuring out. Executive director is a new role for me. First time I've been in that position. And I know that if I let it, it would completely swallow up all of my time and I wouldn't do anything else. And I would be incredibly productive and probably somewhat miserable. Um, so I've really been this has been kind of something that I've been challenged with the past couple months, is just fiercely defending the time that I set aside to further my art, because that's a big part of what makes me happy. I think, just to give some context, I relocated to Portland, which is where I am now, from Manhattan about 2 years ago, and I was living there for about 4 years. And my priorities have completely shifted since I moved. I mean, when I was in New York, I was there to dance and choreograph and teach. And anything that I had to do to make money aside of that, I did. But I really tried to minimize that. I mean, I won't even go into details about what I did to cut expenses so that I wouldn't have to work 2 extra hours a week and I could spend that time taking class. Um, But, now that I've arrived in Portland and I know sort of long term what I'm looking to create, I know that I need to look after myself. And like you said, Jason, finding a some form of employment that provides decent health care is important to me now in a way that it wasn't important to me maybe 4 years ago. Um, and so I've been trying to ride that line, and it's been a struggle. It really has. But it's coming along, I have to say.
Graham, I'm interested in your move from New York City to Portland, about how your relationship with like space has changed, especially with this pandemic. I was in Queens up until very recently, and I didn't realize until the pandemic how much I relied on the city as a third space for my creative life, for just like my like social life. I regularly made like coffee shops and like the mezzanine of the public theater as like my like writing studio. And like there were all these places that I suddenly didn't have access to anymore. These like, you know, these built amenities. And suddenly like my small little apartment in New York City became um so much smaller. You know, I didn't realize how like small it would become. So I'm curious about I know that for me moving to Jersey City, I've gotten a lot more space for this basically the same amount of money. And you know, I'm like not a dancer, but I'm like a writer, and just even having like a small amount of space for myself, like that's private, that's not like inundated in like partners or animals or that kind of thing, has been such like a godsend. So I'm curious about what is life like outside of New York City for you.
And when I was in Manhattan, my places were not the mezzanine, the little public area in Lincoln Center where that
Mm,
coffee shop is. I'm blanking on what the name of it is, but I spent a lot of time. I would come down the A train, get off at Columbus Circle, sit myself down in that area, and type for hours when I needed that space. I also worked at Gibney, which is a dance studio in Lower Manhattan, and that was something that I really appreciated about Gibney was they made themselves open as a space where even if you weren't taking class that day or renting space that day, they were completely welcoming to have people come in, sit in the lobby, like splay out
mhm.
and get some work done. Um, so that really saved me when I was there. And I thank goodness that I didn't have to experience that during the pandemic because I don't know what I would have done. I was living with three other roommates and we would have torn ourselves to pieces, I'm sure. Um, Fast forward to Portland, I'm, honestly paying about the same that I was paying to live with three roommates. And, you know, I have this space. You can see it. This is my dance floor, which has saved me a lot during the pandemic, just this little bit of open space. Um, yeah, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, when the pandemic came down, uh, I didn't have some place to go, and I was not accustomed to spending long hours where I was living during the day. I was clawing up the walls. Um, but a big part of the reason I came out here was to be closer to nature. And I really appreciated that opportunity, even if it wasn't productive space in terms of what my work is. I wasn't banging out emails and I wasn't writing any grant proposals there, but it was incredibly restorative. And that's counted for a lot this past year.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about. I mean, just recently we heard the closing of the Lark in New York City, which was a big play development powerhouse for the New York City playwright scene. And you know, the like my Facebook wall has been flooded not by I guess people like know that like the grant programs and things like that are going to be rehomed at some other institution, but like the the like, it was literally like 1 or 2 rooms that were available to playwrights to come in during the day and write at. And just the loss of that small amount of square footage is, like, immensely deeply felt. And that's incredible to me, you know, like the amount of impact that small amount of space can be, you know?
Yeah, no, it reminds me of before the pandemic, but when Danny Studios closed up
Mhm.
Times Square area, that was a huge loss to the dance community. Which I'm not so familiar with what dance studios have opened up in the last couple of years. I don't think that many during the
I don't
pandemic.
think so. Maybe.
No, it was a huge loss.
Mhm,
Yeah.
Actually, thinking about place a bit more, I was kind of wondering, as you both have relocated to new environments and to new communities, well, I guess Jason, you're still New York adjacent, so still working and connecting with a lot of the same communities that I guess the brand confused transplant all the way over to the West Coast now. And also thinking about um, even like your land acknowledgement at the top of the discussion of that being almost like a tool for place keeping for you in Portland. I'm just wondering about how you both are connecting with your new environment and your communities. And I guess for Grant, how you're also, if there are any certain practices or thinking that you're doing to recognize the cultural history of the place and the space that you're now living in. And so just kind of, yeah, another thing of like relationship of you recognizing yourself in a new environment and building community there, but then also recognizing the newness and just all those different things. So,
Take that off. Yeah, so I left New York in November of 2019, and then I arrived in Portland in January of 2020. And I was ready to hit the ground running. And I had already started to reach out to people that I knew that I wanted to be connected with in the dance scene here. And then something happened in March. I don't remember exactly what, but suddenly networking with strangers just wasn't in the cards for a long time. It's starting to pick up now, and something that to kind of address the point about the land acknowledgement. Something that I've been wanting to do for a long time was connect with. So in as part of Whitebird, we have this program called the Nest program, where we partner with service organizations in Portland, and we're connecting with providers of services to local populations. We have a couple of service organizations for Indigenous residents that we partner with, a few for the houseless community, um, a few for at-risk youth, and the list goes on. We're trying to build that program. And so one thing that I'm just starting to do is to reconnect with those service providers and say, how can we, after the pandemic, come back together? What do you need from us that maybe you didn't need before? And how can we become acquainted, I should say, after for years and years and years, people have known the co-founders of Whitebird as the face of the organization. So I'm just starting now to make those connections after about a year of just I hope we'll meet someday, but who the hell knows when. Um, so that's kind of where I'm at with it right now. But I'd be curious to hear how Jason is coming at that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I didn't realize that after leaving Queens, how much my creative experience and network was based there, and how much the pandemic had taken away from me. Because before the pandemic, I was part of two different playwriting labs that both were kind of rooted in Queens. Um, actually, one in Queens and one in Manhattan. Um, and when the pandemic struck, everything shut down, and we were meeting online for a little bit. But then those both of those labs folded because of they lost funding. If they couldn't meet in person, they didn't feel like they could really recreate the experience that we had cherished when we would be able to meet in person. Um, and so a lot of the things that and then also just like so many of the place-based, like, Queens loomed large in my plays. Like, I set most of my scenes and plays in Queens. I started writing a webcomic that was like set at this very iconic bridge in Queens. And then now that I've moved away from it, I feel so disconnected from those stories. And it's strange because I'm only like what, like 5 miles away from like that place. But like those two bodies of water that I would have to cross to get to this place that where I created the stories feels like so far away, which has been like a new experience for me. they say but right what you know, and I'm trying to like get connected with this new neighborhood and this new city that I'm living in. Um, it's been interesting also watching, the other arts organizations that I've been a part of contend with like how they are managing like space and land and kind of geography in the pandemic. Like I'm a member of a theater collective called a Flux Theater Ensemble, and we also had a monthly in person kind of like pickup theater kind of like event where we would get people together and like make theater on the fly. And that had to end because, and then also we realized everyone was like so Zoom fatigued from like um being in meeting all the time that we couldn't feasibly do like our normal 3 hour kind of devising sessions. Like that was just like exhausting, right? And so we had to change like the and so we began to pursue work that was asynchronous, that didn't involve us being face to face all the time. And so we started creating narrative projects that were not based necessarily in a single time or space. It didn't need to be performed in a single time or space, which has been really interesting. I've also noticed that one of the theater companies that I serve on the board of, like they were before the pandemic, they were just about to launch this whole big multi-year developmental work of this like new, huge, like 5 act giant, like epic work. Um, and they quickly repositioned it to do a digital workshop, and instead of just being like, oh, this is going to be a pale imitation of like a live thing, they like really were like, let's embrace this, let's embrace like the aesthetics of the Zoom, like let's really like work the grid layout, like, and I was so impressed with the things that they were able to do with like set decoration and training the actors on how to work lights and costumes and all this like multimedia stuff from their laptops, doing really elaborate kind of like background designs that would all sync together. It was incredible. But that kind of creativity would never have happened if we were not all dispersed, right? And had to find ways to be creative and use the new aesthetic of this new medium. So I'm curious about how if this Zoom theater will persist once the pandemic ends. If I look at a lot of the aesthetics of Generation Z with like TikTok, where everyone's just like making like videos in their like little you know living rooms and telling really great, compelling narrative stories in like 2 minute like excerpts, um, like what that can look like. So I feel like there's I think we might be cracking a nut on something really exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Graham. Please, please, please.
Oh no, I'm wholeheartedly agreeing. No, I mean I'm seeing some really amazing things. TikTok is a great example. I'm a lot of concert dancers, people who are more in the contemporary dance scene, whatever that umbrella term means. I've seen doing some really amazing breakouts into like shuffle dancing or hip hop dancing that it just they would never be able to do if they were still in that constant cycle of take class, perform, rest, repeat. That's been a godsend, for a lot of people. But I do have to say, as someone who part of their job is to present dance, I'm getting so burned out on watching dance on a screen.
That's actually interesting. Because Jason, also you're a web developer, and you are, I presume, very much in like the digital space. Like you operate there a lot now. And so, yeah, I can imagine the Zoom burnout and also having where your creative practice is now being held in the digital space as well. So I guess it's interesting if you could maybe, if you're, what other spaces you're finding other than your New Jersey City apartment that you're able to explore and investigate more in your creative practice. Or
Yeah,
you're still figuring that out.
sure. No, yeah, I'm definitely very much still figuring it out, but also it's like, so when the pandemic started, I very much found myself like completely kind of bereft of like venues to present my work and people to participate with, and so I kind of like retreated into like my like okay, like like what can I do that's just me, that doesn't require a stage or people, in my room or whatever not. And so like I started writing a webcomic that I worked on last year. I burnt out a little bit on it because I was like putting in so many hours on it, but like that was an interesting experiment. I was like, oh, like actually I can do this, and like I can tell a story all by myself. I mean, it's a lot slower when you have to like do all of uh the stage decorations and costume design and lighting all by yourself with like pen and paper. But it was still exciting to have that kind of control. And another kind of interesting thing, like as a as a developer, you kind of learn, a lot of people think that web development or even just like coding in general is like really, really complex. And as an artist, I could never, like learn, this complicated thing. I will tell you that it is not that hard. I mean, like it's a syntax and it's a language you have to learn, but like if you can run a light board, or if you've ever called a stage, if you've ever been a stage manager, like you can code. I promise you that. But the interesting thing about coding is that like things like it teaches you how to like problem solve in a really expansive way, because in coding, just like playwriting or choreography, there isn't just one way to make a statement or to evoke a feeling, just like there isn't just one way to execute a function. There are a lot of different ways to get there, and then you begin to kind of see like the opportunity of being able to take lots of different technologies and piece them together to kind of do what you're looking to do. I want to give you an example of this. So, Flex Theater Ensemble, we've been working on this project that kind of came out of the Orchard projects. They had like a lab that was like, it was called Liveness Lab. It was all about kind of like what does live performance mean in this like pandemic age. But we decided to create. We wanted to tell a story that was asynchronous, that was narrative, and that could be performed or experienced kind of like on demand. And so we kind of came up with this idea of a narrative interactive telephone hotline. And so we're like, how do we do that? And so luckily, like back in like my boot camp days, I had been exposed to a company called Twilio that operates a API, which is basically a way to program telephone lines, basically like telephone bots. And I was like, okay, well, we could actually create our own hotline. It will take some work and time and a lot of thought and like a lot of like, there will be a lot of constraints, but those constraints actually created a lot of opportunities. And like, well, what do you do when you want to have audience interactions, but you're only limited by like a touch tone phone? Like, what can you ask them to do? And like we had one member who was really, really interested into puzzles and wanted to like get the audience to solve puzzles over this like phone line. And so like the like suddenly like reducing somewhat the inputs from the audience to like numbers or letters on a touchtone phone, like at first seemed impossible, but when he like was applying, like, okay, well, I know that these have to be number based. Like here are the different kinds of puzzles I can actually do with numbers. And that opened up a whole new kind of narrative direction for the story we were telling. Like suddenly it was like, oh, okay, it's this. And like we're going to be accessing secret menus and like all these different things through this hotline. So that was really interesting.
That's awesome. Graham, I guess you now being in Portland, are there any constraints or freedoms that you feel are affecting your work and your creative artistic practice? How's that been being in Poland? And has that affected or changed your choreography and dance?
Yeah, no, it's funny because there are two specific constraints that I think have been really rerouting the way I'm looking at making work. I guess one is not a constraint. It's an asset. I'm just able to afford larger dance studios for the same amount of money compared to what I was spending in New York. So, in New York, I would spend, you know, $10 an hour, something like that, and get like a 10 by 15-foot room. And so that's how I was imagining my work. I was imagining on a really small scale. Um, and the other thing that feeds into that is I had a much wider network of classmates from college, mostly, who had all moved up to New York around the same time I had, and were all taking class together, willing to be in each other's work. So I was imagining, groups of 3, 4, 5 people in these tiny little spaces, um, which is interesting. And then I move over to Portland. Suddenly, I'm able to afford like a 30 by 40-foot room, but I don't know anyone here. So I can find one person that I can work with. And so now the show that I'm creating is 2 solos and a duet. It will be in this fairly large warehouse in Portland, converted warehouse space. Um, but it's just one person and one person, and the two of them together. And I never would have imagined that my work would take that turn. Like, for a long time, I was, I really identified myself as more of a pattern person, and to really execute a lot of patterns in dance, you need multiple people to work their way in. But now I'm focusing so much more on the drama of the individual person. So yeah, it's wild.
I think if you wouldn't mind being able to share a little bit more about how, I guess, Graham, especially you now, because you still work within the arts and culture sectors, as an artist and an administrator, how those positions kind of converge in the sense of, does it make you, as an artist, and you're one who, didn't have healthcare for a while, and you were trying to like save money in any way you could. Now, as an ED and as an administrator, how has that changed your thinking about working with artists and creating programming and thinking about your business structure that has?
Yeah. Something that I've realized about myself since the pandemic came down, and since I haven't really been in the habit of being as part of a dance group, is how valuable autonomy is. Um, and autonomy is something that can be in really short supply when you're a working dancer. Um, you know, this is something that I love about dancers in general, is how willing we are to give ourselves over to someone else's vision, even though that might be dangerous or exhausting or taxing in any number of ways. Um, but I realize that that isn't necessarily what gets me out of bed in the morning. I love to work with artists, and I want to continue to do that through my choreography and my direction. And I'm finding that is really driving me. Um, and that's something that can coexist with my work. Uh, Working as a dance presenter, it's opened my eyes to the inner workings of how large scale dance production actually gets made in a way that I am sure that I would not be exposed to just as a performer. For better or worse, there is kind of this wall in a lot of dance companies between administration and art. It's sort of like the separation of church and state in journalism. Um, and the dancers don't really get exposed to how to put together a writer, how to organize touring logistics, how to book travel efficiently. All of these things that actually make the dance engine run in the United States, at least. I mean, it certainly runs differently, if not a little better, in other parts of the world. Let's be honest. Um, But I'm finding that that work is really informing my choreographic practice and making me think about, okay, how can I go about building this sustainably and intentionally so I can get where I want to be, not just kind of chug along this myth that sometimes we can get fed of you just make your work as good as you can possibly make it. And then one of these days, someone's going to pluck you up and say, hey, you got Moxie, kid. Here's a bunch of money. You know, sometimes it works that way, but most of the time it doesn't. You have to build that for yourself. And so that's something that I've come to.
Yeah. And I guess Ethan, because you chose to professionally transition away from the artistic perspective, do you feel like you have that autonomy within your creative practice? Or, yeah, how is, I guess, kind of going back to one of my first questions about that relationship, but thinking more deeply about your creative practice and, yeah, I guess the autonomy around that. And what are your future pursuits thinking about that?
Yeah, nothing has been better for my artistic uh practice than was leaving the arts, ironically. Um yeah, I found that, like like when I had enough money to be able to cover my basic expenses and not have to worry every month on if I was going to be able to pay rent or how I was, just that, Tetris game of how I was going to make everything fit. That psychic load that was lifted from me was extraordinary. And I will not mince words with that. Like, I honestly believe that the wages that we pay nonprofit arts workers is criminal. It is not sustainable and it is unethical. And I have taken that to the in terms of board governance and what we do. I have often been faced with people saying like, oh, get this really kind of capitalistic mindset around like season and like productivity and like we need to like get everything out, do all this stuff. And it's like, oh, but if we pay this amount of work, pay these people this amount of money, we need to expect this amount of work from them. And I'm like, you know what? Like, there are things that we can invest in that are more than just like an artistic work or a physical space or a program budget. Like investing in people is important. And if we have to do less, then we'll do less. And we have to be able to build our system so that we can accommodate that kind of a friend of mine calls it radical inefficiency, which I love. I'm like, yep, taking that. Because for me, like taking a long view of the work, understanding that the work comes when it will and not like necessarily on somebody else's like timeline, really think like liberates us. It liberated me from that kind of a pressure to always be like, okay, I have to get something done by this time, by this time, by this time. That affected the theater company that I'm a part of. We moved from like kind of a season based kind of like scheduling thing to a project based one, and I can't tell you the amount of uh, good mental health things that did for us as a company because suddenly we weren't like doing things to exhaustion to the bone. We were doing things because from a place of generosity and excitement and of plenty rather than like constant lack. Like imagine that. Um, and then also the other thing is that like having more disposable income, like I view like the like at least part of the money that I'm now making in my new field as an investment in my own creative practice. So like I put aside money every month into a fund for myself that is like earmarked for I guess whenever this is possible, like earmarked to pay actors, earmarked to like rent space, earmarked to give myself art dates, things to feed my creative practice. Like I view, the opportunity cost from like leaving the field that I loved to doing work that it's like I'm good at and pays really well, but is not like my heart's content, I view that opportunity cost as investing in my own creativity. And I hear from a lot of artists who view that kind of shift, or even view paying for things themselves as failure, as like, oh, you couldn't get someone else to pay for it. Like, fuck that. Pay for that shit yourself, you know? Like, you are a boss. I paid for all of this myself. Thank you very much. You know, it's like, do you think Nicki Minaj rolls in and is like, oh shoot, I couldn't get so and so to pay for it, so I can't do no shit? No. Sorry, I don't mean to like use colorful language, but like that is what I'm talking about. We need to like understand that like that it is okay to invest in ourselves. That's all I'm saying.
Um, yes to all that. So many questions from that. But I don't want to diverge too much. But I guess quickly, one, how receptive are the boards to your thoughts around things in structure and operation? And also wondering, um, what is what is that relationship with you and the actors that you're able to set aside money for, and how did that how was that able to be, how was that discussed almost, because they're your collaborators and colleagues, and yeah, just a few questions as well about that.
Yeah, so from the board level, I would say that like I came like there were some practices from like the just like systematic things around how we measured employee like output that we needed to change, because like, people were like being like, oh, we like this person, if this person is going to drop below 40 hours a week and they're not going to be quote unquote full time, we're going to then require them to do all this extra administrative work to log their hours, log what they're doing each hour, etc. And like I understand that there are some like regulatory things you need to do to ensure that we're not exploiting workers, you know, but I don't think the answer is like if the answer is like, oh, we can't pay these people the same amount of money because, you know, like we don't have as much money, I don't think the answer is then to heap more administrative costs on the people, right, to do the work. I think if we're in that situation, we should be goddamn happy that they do any work for us at all, right? If we're paying them less, like I would be happy with like 15% of what you were doing before if I can't pay you a living wage. You know, it's like I am happy with if like I would want us to like also measure our the satisfaction of our employees as a metric to like the performance of the company, not just, you know, and so if we use those metrics in addition to how we are quantifying, you know, our budget and factoring in the cost of retraining a new employee, the cost of like the opportunity cost of like the lost institutional like knowledge, like then it becomes really, really easy to like be like, oh yeah, like take the afternoon. It's okay. I'll still pay you, you know, whatever amount I'm gonna pay you. Like it's okay, the work will get done, you know? That's not to say, and then like doing work around setting goals with your employees or with your collaborators about like, okay, what are the measurable things that we're both gonna agree to? Rather than like, I'm gonna dictate XYZ thing, you know? Because then when we're operating from a place of consent rather than a place of like economic subjugation, I think that is like a better place to like run a company personally. Um, yeah, so that's one thing. In terms of actors, like I I kind of like I did the revolutionary thing for myself where I actually asked actors what they wanted to be paid instead of being like, because like I just kind of like what I had done was I would ask my other playwright friends like, oh, you did this reading, like what did you pay people? Like, oh yeah, I like gave everyone like $100. I was like, oh, I thought that was the going rate. I'm like, well, I'll just pay people $100. And then when I started asking actors what they actually wanted for the work that I was asking for them from them, I was astounded to find some people were like, actually, I don't need money from you. Like, I just want to like be in a room and like do the work and be with people I love, and like that'll be enough. Pay for my transportation. Like, great. Some people like, I have like 15 different things. If you want me to be in this thing, then you're gonna need like I'm gonna need to be able to pay for that hour or whatever. So like moving away from like this like capitalistic mindset where like everything's everyone's a commodity and become more relational people and meeting people where their needs are. And I also have to watch my budget, obviously. But it's like, I had never thought to ask an actor what they wanted. You know,
Yeah, I'm really curious what inspired you to do that.
was inspired by a designer friend of mine who used that as a tactic for pricing for their work. So like they're a graphic designer, and so there were some clients when they would ask like, "Oh, what is your rate?" And they'd be like, "Let me do some spec work for you, and then once I do, I mean, I'll do like a little small thing. I put whatever design thing, send it to you, and you will pay me what you think it's worth. And then based off of that, if you want to work with me again, that will be like a data point. Because like if you totally lowballed me, I will know that I will not take work from you anymore because it's not going to be worth my time. But if you pay me what you think is fair and I think is fair, then we'll work together again. So that was something that like, oh, okay, maybe that can work in other places.
Yeah, no, I completely resonate with that. I mean, something that I now that I've had temporal space in Portland to, pursue things that I've been meaning to get to the whole time I was in New York and didn't have the time. I'm starting to teach dance for Parkinson's disease classes. And, they're small classes. They're still over Zoom. They're not making anybody any money. To their credit, they insist on paying me, a small little set wage for the class. And every time I wish I had the courage to say, you know what, just keep the money. I'm happier doing this class if I'm just connecting with these people. It's not tying it to just this little bit of money that you're able to pay me. Like, I want you to keep that and save it for a rainy day because you're going to need it. Um, and one of these days, I'm going to work up the courage to say that to them. I haven't done it yet. Maybe I'll do it next week. Uh, but working with my dancers, no amount that I'm able to pay them is enough. I mean, the what they put on the line for me, um, in all senses, is just it's not possible for me to pay them what they're worth, and that slaps me in the face every time.
I wanted to also mention something that I've started doing for me personally related to money and equity, is that so like we talked about how I'm making a good deal more than I did when I was working in the arts. And so I don't rely I'm in the habit situation of not relying on uh, my artistic activity to feed me, which I know that's a privileged place to be. Not everyone is in that position, and I totally respect that. But if you do find yourself in my position, I would consider this. So, like, I started doing the thing when I receive commission money to do stuff artistically. Like, I have this project called the Queer Saints Project, where I make illustrations of queer ancestors. Like, I create into posters for marching and Pride. I get a small commission from that. I have started to donate the fees I receive back to the organization, and then I get my company to match that gift. So I kind of feel like an art pirate. I'm like, I'm like not only saying that like thank you for investing in me as an artist and my work, and you've said that it's valuable. I'm going to give that back to you and double it. And I kind of wonder what would happen if there were more artists like me who, are in my position where we are like, we're like, yes, we are kind of like benefiting from capitalism in one way, but able to like, maybe we can, I don't know, divert the funds out of the coffers, to and I think that could be an interesting way of like, I mean, it's not a formalized thing. Not everybody knows I'm doing this, but like, like it's this message that I'm personally giving to um the organizations that I partner with. It's like if you invest in me, I will invest back in you, and and there can be abundance. It's not all deficit.
Right. And it's that sort of personal connection that just isn't possible government to person. You know, the it's I love that. Like the way that we can personally interact and support each other and support ourselves. You know, doing the same thing. When I moved to Portland, I did not know that I was going to be diving back into the arts admin world. I had been kind of steeped in it in New York, and part of me was like, all right, well, maybe it's time to chill out, work at a dispensary for a few years, and just get that Portland mellow. Turns out that is not in my DNA, and no, and I went through a real crisis of conscience, saying, all right, well, am I going to sacrifice this much time, my own time, to make sure that I don't have to rely on art to feed me every month? I don't need it to pay my rent. I don't need it to pay my utilities. I just need it to try and make myself happy. So that's been really freeing, I have to say. Despite the long hours, despite the underpay, despite being fairly low on the priorities list, it has been really nice.
So we have two questions from the attendees. Eric, the one from Erica is specifically for you, Jason, about you asking the actors what they need in terms of wage. So I will pose this first one to you, Graham, or to both of you, really. So would you recommend to artists just starting their careers that they begin in New York, even with all the difficulties and challenges they'll face?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll take it.
Yeah.
I would say artists it's broad, and I wouldn't say that New York is the exact right place for every artist out there. For example, if you're in film, I would say maybe go to LA or go to Atlanta. New York has that going on, but there are vibrant scenes in other places of the country where, you can get just as much work and pay two-thirds of what you would need to pay just to live. I think to kind of extrapolate what the question is getting at, uh, I think when you're young, you need to be ambitious about what you try to accomplish. And you need to be in a place that is going to hone you and sharpen you and challenge you to really face what's important to you. And for me, that was New York. I was living in North Carolina before. I went to college, and I was very fortunate that my parents let me live with them for about a year after college, so I could save up money so I could go up to New York and try to do what I wanted to do. At any point, I could have just said, you know what? I'm happy enough scooping ice cream in Wilmington, North Carolina. This is fine. I'm not breaking any boundaries for myself, but I got something going on. But I think if I had done that, being the age I am now, even, pushing New York aside, I think I would be miserable. I think I would have wasted something, squandered something. So for me, coming up to New York and struggling and figuring out how to balance my budget on an artist's salary, and figuring out what two or three dance classes, were that important to me that I was willing to spend about 2 hours worth of my wage just on that class. Um, that was invaluable. And you can get that in New York, you can get that anywhere. But it's got to be someplace that's going to challenge you.
I would agree with that. There is that saying like, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere.
Yeah.
But the flip side of that is that even if you can't make it here, you can still make it other places. And so I think it's worth like taking a shot on yourself. Obviously that there's a lot of like privilege and a lot of like other family kind of stuff. Like you have someone who can like support you. You have like a lot of like I think the unspoken like secret from like the majority of the New York art scene is that most of its most successful like artists are part of like you know are not just by themselves. They have a spouse that makes a shit ton of money. They have a someone who they come from generational wealth. They like that is it's an open secret that we don't like to talk about, but that's true. Like some of the most celebrated artists have that situation for themselves. So that there's that. But also, like, I think I was listening to The View recently, and there was that day when like everything went down, when like crazy with these COVID tests for two of the co-hosts had to leave, and so Joy Behar is like trying to like answer questions from the audience, and somebody asks her like, what advice do you give to people wanting to start in show business? And she says, be a big fish in a small pond. And I think there's something worthy, good about that. And you can do that in New York, and you can also do that other places too. Because like even if you come to New York and you're going up for the auditions at all the big places, and you're like in that line of like that's like 7 blocks deep of all these aspiring whoever's, there are still smaller places that you can find to hone your craft. That you will have the opportunity to get in front of people to present your work, or you can make that stuff happen yourself. And so whether or not you're in New York or out of New York, I think it's worthwhile just to um, take the opportunity to find the spaces in which you can like fail, and find the places where you're actually competitive.
So not to take it back, but I want to make sure that we get to Erica's question. But so Erica says, love this approach, Jason, about asking the actors what they need. Question though, how do you ensure that certain artists don't undersell themselves?
Yeah, I think that I try and tell people like what generally other people are asking for, or what I've paid people in the past. Like in the past, I've paid people, I'll say like I usually pay people like $100 for a reading for like 12 hours of rehearsal time. That's what I've been paying historically. What do you need? A lot of times we'll kind of go back and forth with like, like sometimes people will be part of a union, sometimes people will be part of, like there will be other considerations that will happen. But I think the thing that I try, actually, this is like a fundraising, like a tool that I learned doing door-to-door fundraising for the DNC when I was in college, was uh, it was forefronting the conversation, privileging our personal relationship. Like you and me, playwright and actor. The most important thing for me to walk away from this experience with is for our relationship to be good. So if we can't come to a number where we're both comfortable, like that is okay. I will not think any less of you as a performer, and I hope you don't think any less of me as a writer or as a producer. And so I think like fronting it with this mutual respect is a really important way of building trust in that kind of negotiation.
Yeah. And if I could springboard off of
Please.
that, something that I've always found really effective when trying to find people to work with is I've never had an audition, and hopefully I never have to have an audition, because I want to know ahead of time that even if money was not a part of the picture, that both of us would walk away with something from our experience working with each other. Um, and that, I mean, that's been difficult in a new city because, you know, I don't know people, and it's difficult to have that conversation at first and say, this is what I'm looking for. What are you looking for? Can we get something out of that? But it happens. And so that, yeah, I totally agree.
Well, that is a pretty great place to leave it. But do you have any final thoughts before we close out?
Oh, yeah, I do. Um, well, first of all, thank you for this. It's been really nice talking with you, Diane, and you, Jason. Um, no, relocating is, I'm not going to say especially in the arts, because moving is just fucking hard no matter what you do. um, it doesn't matter if it's, 5 miles or 3,000 miles. It's just, you lose friends and you lose momentum and things that you've built up in your life and in your neighborhood. Um, but I'm just going to speak from personal experience. Moving from a place like New York, where the pace is just mind blowing to me, to a place where I can get a little bit of breathing room and figure out what is important in my life. I feel like the scope that I'm looking forward has grown from like 6 weeks to 5 years. Like I feel like I can see that far into the future, not knowing what's going to happen because who knows. Um, but I know that things can come together, and I'm not going to be weighed down on all of these just pressures of trying to live. Um, so that's an endorsement of relocation.
Um, my last thought is something that I've learned from the pandemic, whereas like where I basically lost my primary art medium and was forced to kind of dabble in a lot of different things. Um, what I will say is like what I've learned from that experience was one, I forgot what a joy it is to be creative and not be good at it, just to like utterly fail or make complete crap. And that's been wonderful. And to do something not for like the vigor or like the rigor or like the quality or the mastery, but just for the pure joy of making something. That is an invaluable gift that I've discovered. And the second is I am a legendary procrastinator. And the lesson that I'm constantly teaching myself is that, like there's no amount of like perfect circumstance that you are can be waiting for that um that means it would be better not to start to work today, because I so frequently tell myself like, oh, if I just get this opportunity, if I just get this grant, if I just get this thing, then all my answers will be like, you know things will be start moving. I can do everything every single day to move a little bit towards my goal. So
Wonderful. So we have come to the end of our talk. Thank you both so much. It's been really lovely. Just